worked a kitchen for 41 years, and I have never once been under the impression that the work was glamorous. Cafeteria number 7 on Kethterra way station smelled like recycled coolant and overcooked grain porridge, and most mornings it smelled like both at once. The extraction fans above the steam table had been cycling at 60% capacity since before I transferred in, and the maintenance request I filed in my second week had, as of my fourth, still not produced a technician. The tables were stamped alloy, the benches bolted to the floor at angles that suggested the original installation crew had been in a hurry or a disagreement. The overhead panels ran on a flicker cycle that facilities claimed was a calibration artifact, and that everyone else understood to be a slow, dignified death. None of this bothered me. I had cooked in worse. I had cooked on a deep-bore mining platform in the Teth corridor where the galley was a converted equipment locker, and the crew ate standing up, because there were no chairs. I had cooked in a refugee processing center on Vorath Station where the allotted budget per person per meal was less than the cost of the tray. I had cooked through a pressure seal failure, a fuel strike, a 3-month quarantine, and one extremely ill-advised incident involving a spontaneous hull inspection during the soup service. Kethterra Way Station Canteen 7 was, by comparison, a resort. I was 62 when I arrived. The station master, a compact, exhausted woman named Dreva Holt, looked at my transfer papers and said, "We've had 6 kitchen leads in 3 years." "That's a lot of kitchen leads," I said. "The last one left to become a freight broker." "I don't have a freight broker's temperament," I said. She studied me the way people study a wall they're thinking about knocking down. "You come with no complaints from your last 4 postings." "Come with complaints," I said. "I just keep them to myself." She gave me a corner office the size of a storage cabinet and a canteen staff of 3, one of whom was 12 years old and on a learning placement. And I started cooking. My staff were Priva, who was 18, fast-handed, and suspicious of everyone until proven otherwise. Ondel, who was 45, slow and meticulous and extremely good with pastry. And the placement kid, whose name was Sebs, who spilled things and asked questions in roughly equal measure. A month Priva had stopped being suspicious of me. Within 2 months, Ondel had shown me his technique for laminated dough, which was the best I had ever seen, and I told him so directly, and he became a person I could trust. Seb spilled a container of hydrated grain slurry on my boots on his second week, apologized for 8 consecutive minutes, and has been the hardest working person in any kitchen I have run since then. They were good people. The canteen was fine. I say all of this because I want you to understand what Kethterra Canteen 7 was before she arrived. It was not a special place. Was not a meaningful place. It was a place where people ate food that I cooked and left their trays on the belt and went back to work. That was sufficient. That was what I was there for. The Vorath hatchling arrived on the station on a Tuesday. I did not know this at the time because no one told the canteen staff anything. I learned it 3 days later, when Seb came in from his morning delivery, run with his eyes very wide, and told me there was a dragon living in the level 4 quarantine suite. A small one, he said. White. I saw it through the observation window. It was sleeping. What kind of dragon? I asked. He blinked. Is there more than one kind? I had encountered Vorath before, twice, once at a diplomatic hub on the Teth Outrim, where a mid-tier delegation had passed through and required food accommodations, and once on the mining platform, where a wounded elder had been brought in for medical treatment and had spent 6 weeks in the lower hold. I knew enough to know that there were in fact several kinds of dragon, that the Vorath were among the oldest lineages, and that even the smallest of them were not something you assumed anything about without risk. Tell Priva the grain delivery can wait, I said. I'll finish the morning prep. I did not go and look through the observation window. That seemed rude, but I thought about it. The official station communique came out that afternoon, distributed by Dreva Holt, to all department leads, and it said approximately nothing useful. A Vorath emissary-grade hatchling had been placed on Kethterra under a multi-station diplomatic rotation protocol. The hatchling was in a supervised rest period. Standard accommodation procedures were in effect. There would be additional guidance from the Diplomatic Services Coordinator when available. The diplomatic services coordinator on Cael Rennick way station was a man named Vorath Heir, who had held that position for 11 years and who I had spoken to exactly twice, once about an allergy accommodation for a Kethvara trade delegation, and once when he backed his personal cart into our delivery door and dented the frame. He was pleasant and deeply overextended, and the honest truth was that Kethvara was not a station that saw a lot of high-level diplomatic traffic. It was a way station. People passed through. They did not tend to stay. The hatchling stayed. 3 weeks passed before I learned that anyone was supposed to be feeding her. What happened was this. Seb, on a late evening run to the level 4 maintenance corridor, came back with a face that suggested he had seen something he was still processing. He sat down at the prep counter and was quiet for almost 2 minutes, which was unusual for Seb. Then he said, "The dragon in quarantine. Does she eat?" "Everything eats," I said. There was a food station set up outside her suite, he said. Standard supplemental nutrition canisters. 2 of them were still in the packaging. The other one had been opened, but it was full of something green and solid, and I don't think it was supposed to be solid. I put down the knife. When did that station go in? Vorath Heir's department set it up 2 weeks ago. For that, there was a Vorath liaison on the station, a big gray one, but he left. A Vorath emissary-grade hatchling, supplemental nutrition canisters, a liaison who had left, a food station that had been ignored for 2 weeks. I cleaned my hands and went to talk to Vorath Heir. Vorath Heir's office was on level 3, behind a door that had a hand-lettered sign reading Diplomatic Services. "Please knock in a second." Newer hand-lettered sign below it reading also "Please be brief." He was a thin man with the energy of someone perpetually 2 things behind where he needed to be. He looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who had been hoping I was a different problem. "The hatchling," I said. "Canteen 7 is taking over her food service." He stared at me. "She has a food station." "She has 2 unopened canisters and a 3rd one that has expired," I said. "She hasn't been eating. Her dietary specifications are quite specific. The Vorath protocol document specifies." "Send me the protocol document," I said. "I'll adapt the service. What I cannot do is continue serving a meal plan that is sitting in a corridor untouched." Vorath Heir opened his mouth, closed it, and then printed out a document and handed it to me without further discussion. It was 4 pages long, dense with Vorath dietary notation, and it was going to require me to source several things that were not currently in our supply chain. I read it in the elevator on the way back down, folded it into my jacket pocket, and pulled up the supplier catalog before I had reached my own floor. The next morning I had Priva adapt the prep schedule, and I started cooking for her. The first delivery was awkward. The hatchling suite had an outer service vestibule with a pass-through drawer, and the protocol said to place food in the drawer and leave. I did that. I did not look in through the observation window, though I will admit the window was right there, and it would have been very easy to do. I left a small pot of something the protocol document called rendered mineral broth, and a portion of soft-pressed seed cake and a folded piece of paper on which I had written, in letters large enough that I thought she might be able to read them through the drawer slot, the words, "Canteen 7. I don't know why I did that. It seemed like the right thing. You should know where your food is coming from." She did not eat the broth that first day. She ate the seed cake. I noted that and adjusted. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned what she would take and what she wouldn't. The rendered mineral broth needed to be warmer, nearly scalding by human standards, before she would touch it. The seed cake she would eat consistently if I pressed it thinner and doubled the mineral supplement. She would not eat anything with a pale color. I don't know if that was instinct or something about her specific condition, but pale food went untouched every time. I started using dark grain flours and deep pigmented pressed root and a smoked mineral salt that turned everything a dark amber color. And after that, she ate more reliably. I never saw her eat. The drawer would go in full and come back empty, or it would come back with portions remaining in specific patterns that told me something about what she was avoiding. I started to read those patterns the way I read a table. The way a good cook learns to read what people leave on their plates when they can't tell you themselves what they need. She was not eating enough, that was clear, but she was eating more than she had been. There was a dimension of this work that I did not discuss with my staff, because it was not their concern, and because I was not sure I had adequate language for it. Cooking for someone you have never seen is different from cooking for an empty room. An empty room asks nothing of you. Someone you have never seen. Someone whose return trays carry the imprint of their choices, and their avoidances, and their moments of appetite, and resistance, asks something specific. You feel the weight of it differently. It is still cooking. It is still the same physical acts. The measuring, the seasoning, the timing, the heat. But the attention required is of a different order. I found myself thinking about her during off hours in a way I had not thought about a service recipient before. Not with anxiety, more with the qualities of attention you bring to a problem that has not yet fully revealed its shape. The way you think about a complex dish when you have identified what is wrong but have not yet determined the fix. It was not worry exactly. It was engagement. I was interested. Whatever was going on with her, she was communicating through the only channel available. And I was paying attention. The station's small medical officer, a woman named Bren Vale, who handled the station population's general health and who had no specific Vorath training, came to me at the end of the second month and said she had been asked by Fethis Orn to compile a general wellness note on the hatchling. She had not been permitted access to the suite. She had the protocol document, which I had shared with her, and she had a set of general guidelines from a medical species database that she acknowledged were non-specific. She sat across the prep counter from me with her notes and asked what I had observed. I told her. The portion consumption rates, the changes over time, the scale shedding, the color progression. She listened carefully and wrote things down, and at the end she said, based on what you're describing, the consumption trajectory is positive. The pigmentation change in the shed markers is consistent with the developmental literature on Vorath albino hatchlings, which is not extensive, but which suggests that pigmentation deepening in the shed cycle is a favorable indicator. She paused. I am not a Vorath specialist, but what you are describing sounds like progress. The mineral balance was wrong at the start, I said. The standard provision was nowhere near the right composition for her specific condition. How did you know what to change it to? She asked. I read the protocol document, I said, and I watched what she returned. Bren Vale looked at me over her notes for a moment. You've been doing this every single shift, she said. Not a question. Yes, I said. That's, she paused. Chose words. That's a significant commitment for an informal service arrangement. She needed feeding, I said. I feed people. It's not complicated. She wrote something in her notes and thanked me and left, and I went back to the prep. Seb asked me once why I was spending this much time on a single meal plan. Because she's hungry, I said. There are 300 people on this station who are hungry. I feed them too, I said. I feed everyone who comes to the window. She can't come to the window. He thought about that. He was a good kid, Seb. He nodded and went back to stacking trays. The weeks passed. The hatchling's liaison did not return. Fethis Orn sent me 2 follow-up communications from the Vorath diplomatic relay asking for status updates on the hatchling's condition, and I filled out both forms accurately and sent them through, and neither one produced any visible response. The hatchling was, in the language of the diplomatic rotation protocol, an emissary-grade placement, which I eventually understood to mean a low-priority assignment, a hatchling sent to a minor posting, to fulfill some bureaucratic obligation, not expected to be consequential, not expected to require significant resources, not, if I am being plainly honest about what I came to understand, expected to survive the full rotation. The Vorath protocol document had a section in its appendix, headed in formal notation, that Fethis Orn had highlighted in pale yellow before handing it to me. The notation read, roughly translated from the formal Vorath diplomatic register. Emissary-grade placements of albino lineage carry elevated mortality probability during first-cycle acclimation. Standard station facilities are not expected to sustain full integration. I read that section 3 times the first evening. Then I folded the document and put it back in my jacket pocket and went to adjust the mineral balance in the broth. She was not going to die because my broth was wrong, that I could control. What I could not entirely control was what was happening to her physically. Because I was not a vet, And I was not a medic, and I was not a Vorath liaison or a diplomatic handler. What I could see through the pass-through drawer told me things I was not qualified to interpret. The way the empty containers came back sometimes with small score marks in the alloy, claw marks, not deep, but present, told me she was moving. The way the food arrangement in the returned trays sometimes suggested she had sat with it for a long time before eating told me she was thinking. There was once, a week into my second month of the service, a set of 3 small triangular scales in the bottom of the return drawer. They were pale, nearly translucent, smaller than my thumbnail, with an iridescent edge that caught the service vestibule's overhead light and split it into colors I didn't have names for. I held them for a moment, and then set them carefully on the prep counter at the end of a shift. Ondel saw them. He was very still for a moment. "From the hatchling? I think so," I said. He looked at the scales for a long time. Ondel was not a man given to excessive speech, and his silences usually meant he was composing something careful. "When I was young," he said finally, "my grandmother told me a story about a Vorath elder who came to a settlement on the Vara Outer. A farming settlement, my grandmother's people, 300 years ago. The elder had been injured. She stayed with them for a season while she healed. My grandmother said the elder should scales every few days. She said the children collected them. She said," he stopped. "What did she say?" I asked. "She said." The elder told them the scales were a record. That every scale a Vorath shed carried something of what they had lived through. That it was a gift to leave them where you had been kept. He went back to his pastry. I went back to the prep. I kept the scales in a small tin that once held pressed spice and set it on the shelf above my station. After that, there were more of them in the drawers, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes a small handful. The tin filled slowly over the following weeks. Some of the scales were pale. Some were darker, a deep gray-white that had more depth to it, more of the iridescent shimmer. That change was slow. I noted it. I did not claim to understand what it meant. The station population had, by the 3rd month, largely accepted that there was a dragon in level 4, and that Canteen 7 was feeding her, and that neither of these facts required any particular discussion. The diplomatic rotation was an internal Vorath matter, and Keth-Tara way station was not large enough or prominent enough for it to be otherwise. There were occasional comments, the sort of comments that accrue around anything slightly out of the ordinary in a closed station, population, about how long the placement was running, about whether it was normal, about what exactly was happening up there. A cargo crew that had stopped over told one of the freight duct workers that they'd heard the Vorath had written off the station rotation program entirely, that hatchlings weren't being retrieved, that there was some internal political situation in the Ascendancy that was freezing resource allocation. I heard this secondhand from Priva, who had heard it from the freight dock contact, who had heard it from the cargo crew. By the time it reached me, it had passed through enough mouths that I did not know how much of it was true. I filed it away. I kept cooking. I adjusted the mineral supplement upward, based on the new scale color, and what I had read in the appendix notes about second cycle growth indicators. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I kept cooking, because I think it is easy for that phrase to sound like passivity. It was not passive. Every service I prepared for her was considered. I was reading the protocol document the way a craftsman reads a technical specification, not for the rules it stated, but for what the rules implied about the underlying requirements. The document had been written for Vorath custodians, people who would already understand the physiological context. It assumed knowledge I did not have, which meant that every explicit instruction sat on top of an implicit architecture I had to infer from evidence. The evidence was in the return trays, in the shed scales, in the marginal changes in consumption across weeks of consistent service. In the 4th month, I found a secondary Vorath dietary reference in the station's general library archive. A document from a trade posting that had briefly hosted a Vorath diplomatic mission 9 years earlier. That gave me more context for the second cycle transition than the protocol document alone had supplied. I read it twice and adapted the broth formulation accordingly, and sent a note through the supply chain system to request a standing order for the specific mineral compound, the reference described as essential During the transition window, the supply chain system kicked the standing order back 3 times as a non-standard request. For the 4th time, I filed it directly under my kitchen lead authorization, with a note that read simply, "This is a medical dietary requirement for a diplomatic placement, and the previous 3 rejections were an error." It went through. I mention this not to suggest I was doing anything exceptional. I was doing my job. The job had a specific and unusual requirement, and I was meeting it. That is what the job is. There was a morning in the 4th month when the return drawer came back completely empty for the time. Not empty in the way of a partial meal. Empty in the way of a meal finished and a container turned over, and a careful arrangement of 3 scales laid out in a line in the center of the tray that I could not interpret as anything other than deliberate. I stood in the service vestibule for a moment holding the tray and looking at the 3 scales. They were the darkest she had shed yet. A true gray-white now, nearly the color of a winter sky, with the iridescent edge running all the way around each one in a deep violet and copper shimmer. I put them in the tin. I went back to the canteen and started the next service. I told Priva the mineral supplement was working, and she said good, and went back to the line. Seb asked quietly while he was loading the trays, "Is she going to be okay?" "I don't know," I said, "but she's eating." He nodded, in the way that Seb had learned, slowly, across 4 months of working with me, accept an honest, incomplete answer instead of a comfortable false one. That nod meant he understood the distinction. It mattered to me that he could make it. The thing about working a kitchen is that you develop a relationship with time that most people don't have. You always owe in 2 times at once. The time of the current service, which is immediate and unforgiving, and the long time of accumulated knowledge, which is everything you have learned from every service before this one. A cook who has been cooking for 41 years has a very long second time, feel, without being able to name it cleanly, that something was shifting. The scales were darker, the portions were finishing, the return patterns had changed, less avoidance, more what I can only call engagement. The way the containers were being returned was different, more deliberate, in a way that I recognized without being able to explain, the same quality of attention I had seen in a dining room, when someone stops eating out of hunger and starts eating out of pleasure. She was tasting now. She had been surviving before. Now she was tasting. I started changing the meals. Small variations. An added mineral element here. A different pressed grain texture there. I started cooking toward curiosity instead of just toward sustenance. The return patterns told me what landed and what didn't. The dark seed cake, with the bitter mineral rind, she returned consistently only half finished. The dark pressed grain rounds with the smoked amber salt she finished every time. The broth all she had accepted, but now she began returning the container upended, which I interpreted as asking for more. I sent more broth, she finished it. There was a particular morning. I remember the light in the canteen, the way the extraction fans were cycling at their usual inadequate rate, Ondel at the pastry counter, Priva pulling the first service trays, Seb carrying a stack of clean containers to the prep station. A morning about 4.5 months in, when I put together the level 4 tray and found myself talking to the container as I sealed it. Not aloud, or barely aloud. Something between talking and thinking. I was telling her what was in it, naming the components. I do this sometimes with my cooking, not for anyone else's benefit, just as a form of attention, a way of remaining present to what I am making. Caught myself doing it, and I did not stop. It seemed like the right thing. Someone should know what was in their food. What I remember is the quality of that morning. The ordinary weight of it. 41 years of ordinary mornings in a kitchen, and this one the same as all of them. The fan noise, the grain smell, the light through the scratched overhead panels, his voice in the background asking Ondal about a dry goods delivery, Seb's careful footsteps, and me, sealing a tray for a hatchling dragon in level 4 quarantine, and quietly naming what was inside it, because someone should know. I did not know, on that morning, that anything was watching. I did not know that the Vorath Ascendancy's sovereign relay network maintained a passive observational thread on every emissary grade placement. I did not know that the observational record of level 4 quarantine suite, Cael Rennick Way Station, had been reviewed at the relay level at multiple points across the preceding 4 months. I did not know that the particular category of action, a non-Vorath individual providing sustained, adapted, personalized care to an albino emissary grade hatchling with elevated mortality probability, outside any formal diplomatic obligation and without formal compensation, had a designation in the Vorath Ascendancy's archival notation that had not been applied to a non-Vorath individual in recorded history. I did not know any of that. I sealed the tray. I sent it through the drawer. I went back to the canteen. The Vorath delegation arrived on a Thursday 6 weeks later. I learned about it the way I learned about most things on Keth-Tara. From Sebs, who had been in the freight bay when their transport docked, and who came into the canteen at 1100 hours, with his eyes the same width they had been the first day he told me about the dragon in level. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "There are 9 of them." 9, I said. "Dragons," he said. "Big ones, old ones. Slate-colored. They've got gold on their scales. Not paint, it looks like it grew there." They landed, and the whole docking bay went quiet. I don't think I was breathing. Pripa had stopped moving. Ondel had set down his pastry scraper. "Did they say what they were here for?" I asked. Seb shook his head. Dreva Holt met them at the dock. She looked like someone had told her a very important piece of news that she hadn't been prepared for. I turned back to the prep counter and thought about that for a moment. 9 senior Vorath, old enough to have the lineage gold grown into their scales, arriving at a mid-tier way station without advance public notice. I was not a diplomat. I did not have a clear framework for what that meant. But I had cooked for station populations for 41 years, and I had developed a reasonable instinct for when something was about to change. "Finish the lunch service," I said. "All 4 of us. Full service, full portions. Whatever happens, the station still needs lunch." We did the full lunch service. It went smoothly. The canteen was quieter than usual. Word had moved through the station with the velocity that news always moves through a closed population, and people were distracted, watching the corridor junctions, talking in lowered voices. But they came to the line and we fed them, all 312 of them in the lunch rotation. And when the last tray came back on the belt, I sent Seb and Ondal on their break, and Priva and I started the reset for the evening prep. Dreva Holt came to find me at 1400 hours. She had the expression of someone composing their face with deliberate effort. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me across the prep counter and said, "The Vorath delegation has requested a meeting with you." Set down the ladle I was holding. "With me specifically?" "By name," she said. "Cael Rennick, kitchen lead, Canteen 7. They have your full station personnel file. They asked for you by your work classification and your name." She paused. "In that order. Your work classification first." I thought about that. "Do you know what they want?" "They told me they want to speak with the individual who has been maintaining the hatchling's food service," she said. Her voice was controlled, professional, and entirely unable to fully conceal the fact that she was dealing with something that was outside her preparation. They were very specific about the word maintaining. They used a Vorath archival term that the relay translation rendered as something like sustained provision or continuous keeping. The translation flagged it as a formal designation rather than a colloquial description. Folded my apron. I washed my hands. I thought in a brief and completely unbidden way about the tin of scales on the shelf above my station, and about the ordinary weight of a morning 4.5 months ago when I sealed a tray and named what was inside it, for no one in particular. "Where are they?" I said. They had been given the station's diplomatic reception bay on level 2, the largest formal space on Keth-Tara, which was not large by any standard, but was the best the station could offer. When I came through the door, the first thing I registered was the scale of them. I had met Vorath before, twice. Preparation and reality are different things. The 9 were arranged in a loose arc facing the entrance, and they were old, genuinely, geologically old in the way that only became apparent when you stood in the same room with them and felt the quality of the air change. Slate-gray scales, deep and ridged and layered over bodies that moved with a particular economy of effort, the way very large things move when they have been large for a very long time. The lineage gold was not paint, as Seb had said. It was a deep metallic amber that ran in lines along the ridge crests and jaw edges and the leading bones of the wings, and it had the quality of something that had grown incrementally across centuries. Their eyes were copper-colored, all 9 of them, with a depth that made the word color seem insufficient. At the center of the arc was the largest of them. I understood within seconds, from the way the others oriented to her, without deferring outwardly, in the way that only the most senior hierarchies can project authority without performing it, sat with her wings folded and her tail laid flat, and her gaze fixed on me from the moment I walked through the door. She was, I realized, looking at me the way I had learned to look at a return tray, with the full and undivided attention of someone reading what had not been said aloud. I stopped 2 meters inside the door. I did not know the Vorath formal greeting. I knew that standing still and meeting the eyes without flinching was generally correct. And so I did that. The silence lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It felt longer. I was aware, in a peripheral way, of the temperature of the room. That these 9 large, warm-bodied ancient things had altered the air in the reception bay in a way the climate system had not quite adjusted to, and that the warmth was not unpleasant, but was entirely unlike the warmth of the canteen. It was older. That is the only word I have for it. The warmth in the room felt older than the station. Then the large dragon at the center of the arc spoke, Tushnis, in standard station relay language, with an accent that had the texture of something translated from a register that did not have a natural equivalent in human speech. The translation software rendered it in my earpiece a half beat after she spoke, and what it gave me was, "You are the one who kept her." It was not a question. "I cooked for her," I said. "You adapted the provision to her specific requirements. You sustained it across the full acclimation cycle without formal obligation and without compensation beyond your standard station wage. You modified the mineral composition of the provision 11 distinct times in response to observed need. You noted and preserved the shed markers." A pause. "You spoke to the food before placing it." I held still. "I do that with all my cooking," I said. "It helps me stay present to what I'm making." The copper eyes held mine. "We are aware," she said, "that this is not a practice specific to her. We are also aware that in 4 months and 17 days of observational record, no provision was missed. No modification was made for convenience rather than her need. And on one occasion when station supply chain disruption prevented the standard mineral compound from arriving, you substituted from your own personal stores for 11 days without flagging the cost for reimbursement. I had forgotten about that. The supply chain gap had been minor and temporary, and I had not thought of it as a significant decision. I had simply not wanted to serve her something inadequate while waiting for the resupply. "I didn't want to serve her something inadequate," I said. The silence again, shorter this time. "The albino lineage," she said, "has not been sustained through a first-cycle acclimation outside Vorath, primary care and living recorded memory. Our internal probability assessment for emissary-grade albino placements at mid-tier postings is documented. You have read the appendix notation." "I read it," I said. "Then you understand what you were told was likely to happen." "I understood that the standard provision was not going to be sufficient," I said. The standard provision was sitting in the corridor in unopened canisters. Something moved across the copper eyes. I did not have the vocabulary to name it precisely. It was not a human expression, and I was not going to pretend I could read it as one. It was not nothing. "She is alive," the large dragon said. "She entered second cycle acclimation 3 weeks ago. Scale pigmentation is consistent with a healthy developmental progression that our medical advisors assessed as improbable given her initial presentation. She is, by current measure, stable." "I noticed the scales getting darker," I said. "Yes," she said. "You would have." Another pause. This one had a different quality. I became aware gradually that the other 8 dragons in the ark had not moved or spoken since I entered the room, and that their attention was directed at me with an identical quality of focus. It was not hostile. It was something I could not fully name. The attention of people who are witnessing something they have arranged to witness, present, because this moment required witnesses. The large dragon spoke again, and this time the register in the translation software shifted. The earpiece flagged it with a notation I had never seen before, formal ascendancy archival. What it gave me after a half-beat was this: I am Vorath Heir, matriarch sovereign of the ascendancy's third line. I speak in the formal register of the ascendancy's oral record. She paused. Not a conversational pause, a structural one, the kind that belongs to formal speech. What you have done carries a designation in our notation that applies to the continuous and adapted provision of care to a Vorath of the albino, lineage outside primary Vorath custodianship. The designation has not been applied to a non-Vorath individual. It has been applied 3 times in recorded history to Vorath individuals, and each time it was applied, it was understood to constitute an act of singular significance within the ascendancy's archival memory. I was aware that the room was very quiet. I was aware of my own breathing. The designation, she said, is Cael Rennick. In your approximation available in your language's formal register, it means one who kept the fire of the lineage without knowing it was the lineage's fire. I did not speak. I did not have anything to say. The hatchling you have sustained, she said, is Vorath Heir. She is the last living courier of the albino lineage's primary bloodline. The placement on this station was made under a diplomatic rotation protocol at a time when the internal situation of the ascendancy made it necessary to place her outside primary custodianship for her safety. She was placed at a posting that would not attract notice. She was placed at a posting where, in the frank assessment of our diplomatic advisors, she was unlikely to survive the acclimation cycle. A pause. That assessment was incorrect. The assessment did not account for you. I thought about what to say. I thought about the tin of scales on the shelf in my kitchen. I thought about a morning with the extraction fans cycling and Priva's voice in the background and my own hands sealing a tray and naming what was inside it. She was hungry, I said. The standard provision wasn't working. I adjusted the provision. Yes, said Vorath Heir, you did. One of the dragons in the ark, a slightly smaller one on the far left, whose lineage gold had a slightly redder tone at the edges, moved forward a half step. Vorath Heir did not look at it, but acknowledged the movement with a brief lowering of her head, and then the smaller dragon reached forward with one foreleg and placed something on the floor in front of me. It was a scale. Not one of the small shed scales I had been collecting. Those were thumbnail-sized and translucent at the edges. This was larger, perhaps the width of my spread hand, and it was the exact gray-white of the sky in winter, and its iridescent edge ran all the way around in the violet and copper shimmer that I had watched deepen across 4 months of return trays. It had a quality I cannot describe accurately in practical terms. It looked like something that had been given deliberately. Vorath Heir asked that this be returned to you, said Vorath Heir. She shed it 2 days ago. She was aware of the delegation's purpose. She asked that you have the first of her second cycle scales. I crouched down and picked it up. It was warm. It was heavier than I expected, and it had a quality of density that the smaller shed scales had not had. Something settled and deep in the way the color sat in it, the way the iridescence moved. I held it for a moment. Tell her thank you, I said. She will be told, said Vorath Heir. She will also be told that you said it in those words and not in others. She will, I believe, find that characteristic. I did not ask what she meant by that. I had a reasonable idea. The matriarch sovereign straightened. A movement that was not dramatic, but that had a finality of posture that I recognized from long experience as the conclusion of a formal section. The translation earpiece flagged the shift back from formal ascendancy archival to standard relay language. There will be formal documentation of the designation in the ascendancy's relay record, she said, in the standard register now, with a tone that was precise and unhurried. The documentation will carry your full name, your work classification, the name of this station, and the dates of service. It will note the protocol adaptations made and the acclimation outcome achieved. It will be indexed in the primary line of Vorath Heir's lineage record, which will carry her bloodline forward. A pause. That documentation will exist for as long as the ascendancy's oral archive exists, which is, to our current knowledge, indefinite. I was 66 years old. I had cooked in a converted equipment locker and a refugee center and a station under quarantine. I had never once been under the impression that the work was glamorous. I was also, at that moment, aware that I was holding a dragon second cycle scale, and standing in a room with the matriarch sovereign of an ancient lineage and 8 of her senior delegates, and that a designation had been placed on my name in an oral archive that would exist for longer than I was able to meaningfully think about, and that the reason for all of it was that I had adjusted a mineral supplement and named what was in a tray and had not wanted to serve something inadequate. I just cooked for her, I said. Yes, said Vorath Cael. That is what was needed. That is what was done. That is what will be recorded. She held my eyes for a moment longer. Then, with the particular economy of very large old things, she lowered her head in a brief inclination that was directed at me and not at the room, and then straightened, and the arc of 8 shifted with her, and the meeting was concluded. I walked back to the canteen. I want to tell you what I thought about on that walk. I do not think I am able to do it cleanly, but I want to try. 41 years is a long time. I have cooked in good kitchens and difficult ones, populations that thanked you, and populations that didn't, in conditions that were manageable, and in conditions that required everything I had. I have cooked for people in crisis, and people in comfort, and people who were too tired to taste anything. I have cooked through a quarantine and a fuel strike and a pressure seal failure, and I have never once been under the impression that any of it was more than what it was, the work, done as well as I could do it, for the people who needed it. I had cooked for her the same way. It was not a different quality of attention than I bring to any service. It was the same quality. That was, I thought, the point. Not that I had done something extraordinary, but that I had done the ordinary thing with the full ordinary weight of attention it required, and had not stopped doing it when it became inconvenient. The matriarch sovereign had said, "That is what was needed. That is what was done. That is what will be recorded." Did not know how to hold something that large. I am not sure it is something a person holds. I think it is something you carry, the way you carry things that do not fully fit inside you, out ahead of you, present and real, and not entirely within your grasp. The scale was in my jacket pocket. It was warm through the fabric. Dreva Holt was in the corridor outside the reception bay. She fell into step beside me without speaking for a few paces, which told me she had been waiting and had information. She was deciding how to organize. She was good at her job. I had come to respect that about her. The delegation is staying 2 nights, she said finally. They've requested accommodation in the level 2 formal suites, and they have their own provisions. They've asked about canteen access for supplemental service. I'll expand the evening capacity, I said. Tell them the kitchen will serve from 1700 to 2100. And if they have specific requirements to send them to me before 1600. She glanced at me sideways. That's all you're going to say? That's the relevant part, I said. She was quiet for another few steps. They told me, she said, what the designation means. The Diplomatic Services Coordinator got a formal transmission from the Vorath relay with the documentation. He brought it to me 40 minutes ago. He was quite affected. Fethis Orn is a good man, I said. He is, she agreed. He's also been in diplomatic services for 11 years. And he said he has never seen a formal ascendancy archival designation issued to a private individual. He said in the history of his specialty training, he read about 3 such designations, and all 3 were issued to Vorath. She paused, cried a little. I'll make sure the canteen sends him something good with his dinner, I said. Dreva Holt stopped walking. I took 2 more steps before I realized she had stopped and turned back. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not the station master's controlled professional face, something more unguarded. Cael, she said, are you all right? I thought about that honestly, the way I tried to think about things when someone asked me directly. I think so, I said. I think I need to get back to the kitchen. She studied me for a moment more, then nodded once. The particular nod of a person who understands that sometimes getting back to work is the most honest available response. And I went back to the canteen. Priva was at the prep counter. Ondel was at the pastry station. Seb was stacking clean containers on the shelf, and he stopped when I came through the door, holding a container in each hand, and looked at me with the wide-open expression of someone who had been waiting and not entirely able to wait. Are you okay? He said. What happened? Did I say? We're expanding the evening service for the delegation, I said. 2 nights. Tell Ondel I'll need him to stay on for the first service window. Cael, Seb said. I looked at him. You've been feeding her for 4 months, he said. They came all this way. They asked for you by name. That has to mean something. I set my jacket on the hook and pulled down my apron. It means the mineral supplement was working, I said, which I knew. Seb stared at me, then slowly, something in his face settled. Not the resolution of uncertainty, but the recognition of something he was filing away to think about later, which was what I had learned was his particular form of wisdom. He put the containers on the shelf and went back to his work. I went to my station. Tin was on the shelf where I had left it, the accumulated 4 months of shed scales, the pale, translucent early ones, and the deepening gray-white ones, and the first of the second cycle, the one I had just carried back from level 2, and added to the rest. I looked at the tin for a moment. Then I turned to the prep counter and started on the evening service. The extraction fans cycled at 60%. The overhead panels ran their flicker. Ondel moved at the pastry station with his characteristic unhurried precision, called out the supply count in her usual tone, professional and slightly skeptical of the universe. Seb stacked trays with the focused care of someone who has learned that spilled things require cleanup, and that it is better to be careful in the instance. I cooked. I cooked the way I had cooked for 41 years, the food in front of me, the people to be fed, the things I knew how to do applied to the things that needed doing. I cooked for the evening service, and I cooked for the Vorath delegation, and I, as I did every shift, for the level 4 delivery. The level 4 tray went through the pass-through drawer at the usual time. I had adjusted the mineral broth upward again. The second cycle notation in the protocol appendix suggested a significant increase in mineral demand during the transition period, and I had made the pressed grain rounds slightly larger than usual and added an additional element that the appendix described as a traditional growth phase complement, a dense pressed cake made with a specific combination of dark mineral salts that the document called, in its formal notation, the third sharing. I had not made the third sharing before. The compound was technically within our standard supply range, and I had simply not known to make it until I had read the second cycle section more carefully. I sealed the tray. I labeled it Canteen 7. I thought about what was inside it. I did not say it aloud, not entirely, but I named the components quietly. The way I had been doing for 4.5 months, the way I do with all my cooking when I want to stay present to it. The evening service went well. The Vorath delegation was not what I had expected, which is to say they were what any kitchen worker recognizes as good guests. They sent their requirements before 1600. The requirements were specific and clearly communicated. They ate what was served. Turn containers came back clean. 2 nights later, the delegation departed. The docking bay, Seb reported, had gone as quiet on their departure as on their arrival, and they had filed out with the same economy and the same ancient unhurried wait. Dreva Holt sent me a formal communication of thanks from the station's administrative record, which I printed out, folded, in the drawer with the supply invoices. Because it was a formal communication, and that was where formal communications went. Sereth remained on Keth-Tara. The rotation protocol had been updated. Her placement was now classified at a higher tier. In practical terms, meant that a full Vorath liaison arrived within the week, and Orn received a direct communication from the Vorath Ascendancy diplomatic relay with a set of formal courtesies that he brought to me at the canteen, holding them in both hands, with an expression that suggested they were heavier than they looked. "These are for you," he said. "Put them in the drawer with the invoices," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "Cael," he said, "do you understand what has happened?" "Understand that the level of the placement changed and now was no proper liaison," I said, "which means the food service coordination will be cleaner. I've been working around some supply chain gaps that a proper liaison channel should." Oh. He was quiet. Then, "The Ascendancy's formal documentation says she would not have survived without the adapted provision protocol. The standard canisters were expired," I said. I adjusted. Orn was a pleasant man and a genuinely capable one when he had the resources to with. He stood in my kitchen doorway for another moment, and then he nodded. The same nod Dreva Holt had given me in the corridor, the recognition of an honest answer, even when it is not the whole of what could be said. And he took the formal courtesies with him, and I went back. Prep. The tin of scales stayed on the shelf above my station, the single second cycle scale, Vorath Heir's, the one Vorath Cael's delegate had placed on the floor for me, the one she had asked to be returned. I eventually moved to my personal quarters, not because the kitchen was the wrong place for it, but because I wanted it somewhere I could see it when I woke up in the mornings. It was still warm when I picked it up. Every time I picked it up it was warm. The new liaison, whose name was Vorath Desh, was a mid-rank Vorath adult, younger than the delegation had been, with dark gray scales and the first faint beginnings of the lineage gold along the jaw ridge. She was brisk and competent, and she sent me detailed, updated dietary specifications within her first 48 hours on the station. The specification included the full second cycle complement, which confirmed what I had already worked out from the appendix, and one new element that I had not encountered before. A section headed, in the formal Vorath dietary notation as Keeper's Complement, was a slightly enlarged portion and an additional mineral element to be included in the provision going forward. I read the annotation on that section 3 times. The annotation said, in the formal register, that the Keeper's Complement was a traditional second cycle addition to the provision schedule, and that it was offered in acknowledgement of the provision relationship when the provider had been designated under the archival classification that applied to my situation. The extra portion, the annotation explained, was to be understood as a gift from Vorath Heir to the person who had kept her, something beyond the sustenance given back in kind. I made the Keeper's Complement the same way I made everything else. I sent it through the pass-through drawer, at the usual time, with the tray labeled Canteen 7. The return drawer came back empty, the way it had been coming back for months. Clean and clear, with the deliberate arrangement at the center that I had come to recognize as hers. And, at the center of the arrangement, this time was a single scale, smaller than the second cycle one she had sent with the delegation, darker. A true deep gray white with the iridescent edge, fully developed, clean and settled, and entirely itself. I picked it up, put it in the tin with the others. I went back to the canteen and finished the prep. Priva was at the line. Ondel was at the pastry station. Seb was stacking clean trays. And when I came through the doorway he looked at me. And I looked back at him, and nothing needed to be said, and we both went back to work. The extraction fans cycled at 60%. The overhead panels ran their flicker. The service started, and the station population filed through. And I fed 312 people, and then I reset for the next one. That was the work. That was what I was there for. Some mornings are ordinary. Some mornings something enormous is watching you do the ordinary thing. You cannot always tell which is which, and in my experience you do not need to. You only need to do the work well enough that it would not matter either way. I sealed the next tray. I named what was inside it. I sent it through.